Welcome back to our One Wild and Precious Lives and our dogs. Today I'm joined by my friend and colleague Kayla Fratt. A few months ago, we talked about utopia for humans and dogs on Kayla's podcast. And today, I'd love to hear from Kayla about her politics and how it's interwoven with dogs and conservation work. Before we dive in, I usually ask my guests to introduce themselves by means of their dogs. And one of yours has been in my thoughts a lot lately. How is Barley doing?
Yeah, no, thank you for asking. We can start out, I guess maybe I'll do a brief overview of the dogs and then we'll get into Barley. So I currently have 3 dogs. We'll start with the youngest. The youngest is Skipper. He's a 1.5-year-old working Cocker Spaniel that came to me via rescue, and he's a ball of joy. He is like the most dog I've ever met in my life. Everything dogs like. He likes mud, he likes dirt, he likes fetch, he likes digging. He's just joyful. He sleeps inside a sleeping bag with me if I let him. It's amazing. And he's been the best working dog I've ever trained so far. He's amazing. And he's got a perfect little tan spot right in the center of his forehead that we call his kissing spot, which is very important for everybody to know. And then my middle child, Niffler, is a border collie. He's my one dog from a breeder. He's super duper wonderful. He's gorgeous. He's got big old bat ears and he's a blue merle, and he's my sensitive, sweet boy who just loves nothing more than to go fast in life. He's also a conservation detection dog and just wrapped up a project finding endangered box turtles, which he really enjoyed. He thought they were pretty cool. And then my oldest dog is Barley, and I've had Barley for 9 years now. He's also a rescue. He's also mostly border collie, although he's got a bit of chow and Labrador and super mutt thrown in there just to keep things exciting. And Barley is the first dog I got as an adult. I got him when I was like 22 or 23. And he's been my main conservation detection dog. He's been with me since before I got into the field. He was kind of the dog that I got when I had a rough idea of what you were looking for in a working dog. And I was working at a shelter, but I didn't have the job yet. So I didn't want a dog who was going to destroy my life if I didn't get him a job. I overshot on that one, and he did totally upend my life anyway, in the best of ways. And yeah, Barley has continued working through, he's 12 and a half now, and he has just now officially retired. And that's largely, entirely because he was just diagnosed with lymphoma. So he's got a type of cancer that is highly treatable with chemotherapy, and most dogs achieve remission with chemotherapy, but it is not curable. It's treatable, but not curable. So we are kind of in the midst of that particular, end of life, hellhole, I think is a fair way to describe it. On the good days, I'm able to, look at him and say, hey, he's still got good quality of life. He's still happy. We're swimming, we're fetching. He's eating lunch every day now because we're trying to put some weight on him before the cancer starts taking weight away. And then, on the flip side, I'm looking at him and thinking, gosh, 2 months ago, he was working in the field. We did a 12-kilometer, 5-hour search just 2 months ago, and he looked great. He looked like a dog half his age. And yeah, I expected to have a longer retirement with him, but we're probably looking at a couple months left. It could be a couple months to a year, I guess. It kind of depends on his response to chemo and how he tolerates it and how his cancer responds. And then kind of remission times vary quite a bit from there. But when it comes back, that'll probably be the end. So yeah, that's terrible. I've been doing a lot of crying.
Yeah.
We're also just really trying to focus on what he wants and what he needs right now. We are fundraising to support the costs for cancer. He's insured, but he's insured at 70%, and they don't cover this and they don't cover that. So the costs are still kind of piling up. We're just trying to figure out how to make sure that the time he's got left is the time that he wants, and figuring out how to balance end of life care and death with dignity for a dog, which is not something I've navigated before, but it's something I've thought a lot about. And I don't know, this is a huge bummer of a way to start off a podcast, but it's also the only thing that I think about ever right now.
Yeah, no, I mean, what you shared this morning about how his activity level is changing, how he gets tired earlier, and your thoughts about that, I was like, yeah, like I would also definitely prioritize quality of life. I think that it's so different thinking about it in theory and being in the midst of it.
Yeah, it's really challenging. And we've got a wonderful veterinary team. So I've actually got 2 different conversations scheduled for this coming Friday. So 2 days from now, as we're recording, to talk to both the oncologist and our integrative vet. Because obviously the oncologists, the way that my partner puts it is the barber is going to tell you need a haircut. And the oncologist is going to say, we've got options. We can do this with chemo. We can do that with chemo. We can do this length of treatment. We can try this drug. That's her job. And she does it very well. And we really like her. And then the integrative vet, I think I'm really glad we already have one on the team. She's our rehab vet as well for like all of my dog's sports medicine things. But, talking to her about, gosh, if he can't be on pain meds because of how they interact with the chemo, and that's causing him discomfort at night, and that's not even related to the cancer. That's just because he's, an aging working dog and sometimes his hips bug him or whatever. Gosh, do we want to keep doing the chemo if the chemo also makes him a little nauseous? And, but then making those decisions when that the less chemo we do, the less time we get with him. Yeah. And again, it's really easy in theory to say that you want them to have the best time and not the most time. But then it's another thing when you really have to come face to face with that. And I think most of us ultimately have to make some of these decisions for loved ones, whether it's our parents, our pets, a partner, ourselves. But yeah, I don't know if anything prepares you for it. I feel like I've done a lot of thinking and it still feels really hard.
Yeah, I feel like it's like easy to think along with your values, but then you see the dog or the person in front of you and that goes out the window.
Yeah.
And also, no objective right answer to these things.
Mm-hmm. I've got another friend who's going through a cancer diagnosis with their dog and they're pursuing clinical trials. They're going, and they've got a completely different cancer situation. They've got a completely different situation to me, but like they're looking at, flying or driving or whatever cross country to go get into clinical trials and looking at surgical options. And like, with lymphoma, there is no surgical option. But I think there's a lot of right answers and everybody knows their dog best and knows, and everybody's doing the best they can for their dog at the time. But yeah, it's an honor. I've been looking forward to and dreading his retirement for a really long time. And we've been incredibly lucky as a partnership that he's been able to work for as long as he has. And that, he really was. I mean, he worked the week in between when I found enlarged lymph nodes and when we got the confirmation of diagnosis. The day he got the diagnosis, he found 15 scats and he had a great day in the field. And that's what I've always said I've wanted for him, is I think he never was going to be a dog who was going to enjoy laying in sunbeams and cuddling in retirement. So it's again, there are a lot of upsides. There's something kind of nice about knowing that you don't have a lot of time and it helps kind of refocus your priorities. And then on the flip side, we've got politics to talk about, which I'm sure will also be uplifting and invigorating. But honestly, like one of the hardest things that I don't think I've heard people talking about, but there is this other kind of twisted downside to having time left, which is that, we're looking at the fact that he could live anywhere from a couple more months to a year and change from now. And we're looking at, gosh, I have these different projects that I was supposed to go out on for canine conservationists. And we were planning a vacation that was going to be a really big deal for the family at some point. And, how to figure out those sorts of things. And I'm not saying like, oh, boo-hoo, my dog needs veterinary care and I can't go on vacation. But there is this like, how long are we putting everything on hold? And, my therapist would say that like, I also need to take care of myself. But like, obviously the worst thing that would happen would be like me being out on a project and being uncontactable or on vacation and not able to get home.
Yeah.
And yeah, like that's really complicated.
Yeah.
Because again, it's very easy to say in theory that like I'm going to just put my entire life on ice and focus everything on him, but that's not entirely possible.
Like that's possible for you have like
a week, a
week.
month.
Yeah, or a month, even a month, yeah. But like it's like, well, couple months to a year, like that, you can't put your life on hold for a year. That's
I mean, it's July right now, and I'm trying to decide. I had a project actually in Guatemala that we've already delayed once, and I was supposed to go in November, and he should be fine in November, but do I want to miss some of his last good weeks either? So we've already agreed to delay that project. That project partner was really gracious and understanding and said it wasn't a rush, and that's fine. But yeah, and even like even on like weekend things where I could bring him, okay, if I can bring him, that's great. But how far away do we want to go if we need to be ready for contacting a veterinarian or whatever it is? I don't know. It's, as I said, I've never had to do this before.
And I mean, even if you have done it before, it will be different with every dog, every diagnosis, every point in your own life. It's not like you can do it once and then and then the next
time.
Yeah,
I mean, the last decision, end of life decision I had to make for a pet was my 19-year-old childhood cat who died when I was like 27. And I came home to, my dad and the cat and kind of saw the cat for the first time in a couple months and said, Dad, I think we got to go in. Yeah. And that was so much easier. The cat was 19. He'd had kidney failure for a little while, and I think my dad just needed some help making the call. Yeah. And that's like the main experience I've got. I've had 2 19 to 20-year-old cats die of kidney stuff. And that's, now at this point, that's kind of what I almost like, that's what you hope for with a cat, is that they make it to 19 or 20 and then they die of kidney failure. Like that's you hope your cat lives long enough for that to be their fate.
Yeah, and also if you don't live with that, like in the case of your childhood cat, with you not having been there and then coming home, you had that outside perspective a little bit because you haven't seen the cat in a while. Yeah. So like you can see something that your dad probably couldn't, because if you spend every moment with this animal or this human or the human animal, also an animal. Yeah. It's hard, like. Yeah. Yeah,
it's a lot easier to miss the like the 0.1% decline day over day or week over week when you're living it versus when you've been away for a while. And yeah, I think it's really easy to say in theory that you want to make sure that you live up to this ideal of it's better to let them go a day too early than a day too late. And it's another really hard thing to say, okay, how do you make that call? Exactly what is too early,
how do
too late?
It's not like there's this myth sometimes that quote unquote you'll just know, but that's not true. Yeah.
Yeah, I think people have to tell themselves that, and I'm okay with telling myself that if that's a thing my brain lets me do, I think I'm gonna go with it. I don't know. I contacted a death doula the other day who said that they'll work with pets. I'm going to have a call with them tomorrow, so we'll see how that goes. Like, I don't know. Does anybody have anything that they can help me with? And I think this is also certainly where people turn to, animal communicators or, crystals or, spirituality or whatever it is. And unfortunately, that's just not the way my brain works.
Yeah. I mean, yeah.
So like, figuring out.
I couldn't do crystals or spirituality, I think. I don't know how death doulas work. So
yeah, the theory that I've heard, and I don't know exactly, like I haven't met this person yet, but like the idea is kind of a person who's an advocate for the outpatient experience through, like a midwife or a doula would for birth, but for death. And I think somebody who kind of has experience with palliative care and death and dying. And also, like, honestly, weirdly, I should talk to my sister more about this. She's a medical doctor, and she very nearly went into palliative care. As a human medical doctor. She took a class in med school called Death and Dying that like changed her life. She ended up going into physical medicine and rehab instead. You can see that we are cut from similar cloths. And I've been meaning to talk to her. She doesn't do pets. She doesn't do dogs. I mean, she's got 2 cats, and she, again, we cut from the same cloth. It's not like she doesn't like them. But yeah, and there's also obviously some similarities and some differences. So I don't know. It's hard. It's really, really hard. And like, I'm kind of able to put things in a box, especially when I'm like on a podcast, and like your listeners don't need to hear me crying, but like, don't worry, there's a lot of that too. I'm just able to like you kind of have to be able to compartmentalize and like, not burst into tears when you pass a stranger and they say, "Oh, what a cute dog." Because I have done that a couple times, and strangers find it really uncomfortable.
I can imagine.
Yeah, it's all okay. I mean, it's not okay, but like,
No, I mean, it's not okay, but it is okay. It is okay to cry anytime you feel like it.
Yeah.
It's not okay that this is happening. It shouldn't be happening to anyone ever. But
dogs are supposed to live until they're 45.
They're supposed to live as long as we do, and that's it.
Yeah. And, and honestly, I know we're joking, but like, I have friends with parrots and tortoises, and like, there's a whole bunch of other complications that come in when you do have really long-lived pets. So like, as much as it sucks, it might be for the best.
No,
at least as far as dogdom on a whole goes. I don't know. I'm not in charge of this, so I don't need to have an opinion about it.
No, that's true. Well, before we change course, how can our listeners contribute to Barley's fund?
Yeah, so if you go to, let me make sure I get the link right. It's donorbox.org/barley-lymphoma. And barley is spelled like the grain, BARLEY, and then lymphoma is LYMPHOMA. We can also just get that into the show notes or something. Yeah, and if you can't donate financially, but if you know of Barley, know of us through kind of our journeys together, I'm trying to collect as many stories of how Barley impacted people as possible. So you can send those over to me. You can put them on his donor wall at that same link. We're also hopefully going to be doing like a silent auction sort of fundraiser at, so I'm in a PhD program, and so I'm going to be getting my doctorate. And we have been saying since before I started that Barley also deserves a dogtorate when he graduates, because he's been here for every step of the way. He's done as much hard work as I have in a lot of ways. I'm not going to finish my PhD in time for us to do that together. So we are hoping to do some sort of dogtorate ceremony for him. My PhD advisor has agreed to help facilitate that, which is really cool of him. And all of that is to say, if you are an artist or a maker or a doer of some sort, and you'd like to contribute something towards like a silent auction fundraiser, you can also do that. So that you can just contact me directly as well. And I'm pretty easy to find on the internet. Just reach out. Everything that goes to Canine conservationists comes across my inbox one way or another. I prefer email over like Instagram DM, but like I'll see it. if Instagram's the way you got to do it.
Thank you. Yeah, and your name on Instagram.
Oh yeah, my personal name on Instagram is Collies Against Borders. But you can also just contact us through Canine Conservationist. My personal Instagram is private, just because sometimes dog people on the internet are a tough crowd.
Yes.
So I'll let just about anybody follow me, but I like being able to boot people if I have to.
For sure. All right.
Yeah.
Well, let's change directions and talk about the beautiful landscape that is politics these days.
Woo!
Is there a term or a sentence that describes you politically?
Yeah. Yeah, like Yes, maybe. Um, I think kind of broadly right now, I would call myself a lefty or a leftist. I think I probably most closely align with anarchism, although I have this like imposter syndrome around the term in that I haven't read any theory of any sort. I basically listen to podcasts and talk to friends. And I think, I certainly feel more aligned with anarchism than communism in general, which is kind of, those are like the two main flavors available in Oregon when you're talking to lefties. But yeah, and then within the US, that means that generally I kind of begrudgingly vote Democrat because I, at least personally, currently at this point, view that as like a harm reduction measure. And not at the hugest fan of electoral politics, especially at like the national level at this point. But again, harm reduction is something that I can accept on a lot of different levels. So yeah, I guess anarchist, but like lefty.
I like that.
Yeah.
How have you arrived? How have you found that term for yourself? And also, you mentioned a while ago that it kind of overlaps with your journey into dogs.
Yeah.
That's true.
Yeah. How did that happen? So I guess, going back to like my first kind of like political awakening, I grew up outdoors in the woods. My dad's a conservation biologist. I grew up on 40 acres and I was like immediately instinctively very pro animal rights and very pro like habitat preservation, biodiversity conservation, climate change awareness. Those were causes that even as like a pretty young person, I'm talking like 10 years old, I like Aldo Leopold was a guy that I knew about, who's kind of the father of North American conservation in a lot of ways, and a big the kind of the first guy who said that in North America on a big stage, who said that maybe we shouldn't eradicate all of the predators because maybe they're important. So anyway, starting really, really young, those were like my main focuses, which kind of automatically put you somewhere on the left side of the spectrum in general, in the US at least. And then, yeah, so dogs come into it in that I think then through college, I started getting a little bit more interested in other kind of political ideas or like other political causes, I guess. Like as I get into college, I start thinking a bit more about like reproductive rights and justice and women's rights. But I wasn't still like super intersectional or super radical in any way. Just kind of broadly leaning in all of those directions and starting to care a little bit more about things that weren't kind of directly related to the natural world. Although I'm not going to say I was good about that early on. And then I started training dogs. Also around this time, I started training dogs in college, and I got really lucky with some really amazing mentors who were very into the ideas of, seeing dogs as whole beings with emotional lives, and seeing dogs who are, reactive, barky, ledgy, whatever you want to call it, whatever kind of behavior problem, as a dog that's having a hard time, not giving you a hard time, those little isms that you start hearing as you get into dog behavior. And I just remember there was a point probably late in college or maybe early in my couple years right after college where it kind of clicked into place for me that the same level of care and protectiveness and advocacy that I felt for dogs that needed, a systemic understanding of what they needed, like to holistic support on a behavioral for like behavioral health. And I wish I could give you like a good example of exactly what I mean here, but these sorts of dogs where I had gone from just clicker training my way through working with these dogs, to really looking at like what they needed at the home and whether they were a good fit and what was kind of their duty to society and what was society's duty to them and all of these sorts of things. Anyway, all of those things that I was thinking about within the dog world, there was just like kind of a day, and maybe it happened over weeks, I don't know, months, where I had the same realization about like unhoused people and was like, man, if I don't think that a dog should be punished for biting a kid, I don't know if unhoused people should get in trouble for like defecating on the sidewalk when there is nowhere for them to safely go. And that was like the moment where like I'd been hearing about intersectionalism. I'd been, maybe giving lip service to this idea of like broader, more radical human rights. But the dogs were kind of the way that it all clicked for me. And I kind of started extending the same grace that I was giving dogs to people, which is maybe not the most noble way to come about it. It seems like it should be easier to do it for people, but I think there's so much cultural fog around people. And, this was probably in 2016 to 2018, I would guess, is where this was happening for me. And I think it still was pretty unusual for people to talk about like harm reduction and like free, safe injection sites and housing first approaches to homelessness. And, a lot of these other things that I think I hear about a lot more now in the US. And again, I know you've got a more international audience, so I'm obviously speaking from my experience as somebody in the US. But yeah, really starting to look at that through seeing the same through lines with people as I did with dogs, and starting to really care about those things as like valuable and important in and of themselves, and not just, again, like climate change and biodiversity loss and those sorts of things, which I'm not gonna lie, like those are still kind of my pet causes. Those are still the things that are most likely to get me out and advocating more. But dogs definitely help me kind of see the rest of the situation more clearly.
I love that. Like, yeah, they were your entry level drug.
Yeah.
And like they're easy to get into, right? You didn't even you just love dogs and you got into training them, and all of a sudden you want to change the world.
Yeah. There just kind of got to be a point where it was like I couldn't look at a dog that was behaving in a way that we would prefer it didn't, and like see all of the ways that was structural, and all of the ways that was not really a choice for that animal, and that the structure and the systems around it needed to change fundamentally in order for it to have a different response. And then there's a point at which once you really kind of get that, it's hard to not see it with people as well, at least for me.
I totally agree. Yeah. There's so many things about life in general that I have learned through dogs. Because that was one of my first really nerdy interests that I really went deep on. And then at some point, everything started to feel like, or dog training started to feel like, or living with dogs started to feel like a metaphor for everything else.
Yeah.
You start seeing parallels everywhere.
Yeah, absolutely.
If you could change anything or wave a magic wand, what the future look like? An ideal future where all the things that you currently are unhappy with in the world around yourself, that you see around you, in the world in the world as it is.
I want to see more people and every other animal really on the planet ideally have more genuine autonomy in their lives. I think this comes back to, there's a ton of discourse currently, it's particularly hot online, but kind of always about like off-leash exercise in nature for dogs, and that often can come back to an accessibility issue. I would love to see that fixed. I would love to see people and their pets having time, the support in order to be able to go do those things. I want people to be able to make art, spend time in nature, do wonderful things, feel and genuinely be kind of financially supported enough that they can do that. I'm not anti-work exactly, but I don't I think like I love the work that I do and the research that I do, and I find like vigorous pursuit of arbitrary and very real goals really satisfying, and I think many of us do. But yeah, I want to see all of us having more time and ability to like be out in nature or not, and I think most of us probably need more of that, even if we think we don't, or we think we don't like it. Um, and I don't exactly know how to do that structurally. I do think, there are like a couple key things that come to mind, and I'm not, the world's best expert on any of these by any means. But, for example, a huge part of why we have so little access to nature in a lot of parts of the US is because of gigantic crop production, and a huge amount of our crop production goes towards feeding livestock that are raised for meat. And I guess the biggest thing that I think I was a radical on was I wrote a paper in 10th grade on factory farming, and I became a vegetarian after that. I like stopped eating meat in 10th grade after like the first time I really looked into factory farming. I just couldn't do it anymore. And, I think we could do a lot for the preservation of biodiversity, for the reduction of climate change, and for an increase in natural space that's accessible to people and dogs, and also gives people and their dogs places to recreate that are safe and fun and in nature, but also separate from really ecologically important habitat. Because currently, again, in North America, part of our North American wildlife model is that we protect areas that are particularly important habitat for wildlife. And then we try to also turn those into areas that are recreation for people, and their pets. Maybe they're off-highway vehicles, whatever it is. And those two goals are really at odds. And as an ecologist as well, I come back to this, this you look at like a map of Oregon, and you look at like the size of territory that a wolf pack needs. And you're like, wow, there's really very, very few places that a wolf pack could conceivably have a territory that isn't going to overlap with free-ranging cattle, free-ranging sheep, suburban, exurban areas. And, I want to live in a world in which wolves have a right to exist, in which there are enough wolf packs that there's connectivity between them, that they can have genetic diversity. And it's not just the wolves, it's everything else, but they're a great example. I also am a wolf biologist now. And that's part of my utopia as well, is figuring out, I'm somebody who wants to live in nature. I want to live in the woods. And I recognize that with the current population of human beings we have on this planet, that is not possible if we want to have nature left for nature and natural spaces left for us to recreate in. We got to figure out a way for us to go vertical with our societies. I don't love that for dogs and what that means. I don't think living on the third floor apartment was the best place that Barley has ever lived. That's where we lived for the first year after I got him. We made it work. Yeah, and like that's where I feel like some of my images and like wishes for the future start coming into conflict with each other. And I don't know how one like really could figure out a good way to give nature the space that nature deserves, and give people and dogs space in nature that they need, and honestly have the population of the planet that we have right now. And I get really uncomfortable when I start talking about this, because it starts sounding really close to ecofascism, and like that's not what I'm saying. I don't think that there is any reasonable way or good way to reduce the human population on this planet, without going some extremely bad and terrible places. Yeah, so that's where I start kind of feeling like I have this vision of utopia and vision of what I would like to see, and I don't know how to make it happen with what we've got currently.
I forgot to say this during the original conversation, and asked Caden to put this in for me. But one of the best possibilities that we have for reducing population growth rates, which is not quite the same thing as reducing population size, but reducing growth rates is necessary, in order to get to a smaller population eventually, is, women's rights and reproductive rights and educational attainment and later marriage, all support reductions in population growth, and focusing on the intersectionality of that, focusing on supporting women's rights and family planning and the ability to choose when and how to have children, time and time again has shown that it will decrease the rate of population growth. And we do see in a lot of countries where women have a lot of autonomy over their reproductive choices, populations are actually falling. There's a lot that goes into this, and this is way far outside of my area of expertise, but that is a really important note that I forgot to mention. And when I was listening to this back, I think I sounded even more doom and gloom than I intended to be. Thanks, Caden.
What is the habitat that one wolf pack needs?
Oh, that's a great question. It's like hundreds of square miles. It depends a little bit on the prey base available to them. So for example, the wolves that I study in Alaska actually can take a lot less area because they are able to eat marine resources. They eat like a surf and turf diet, so they don't need as much like square area because they're also eating like fish and sea otters. Very quick Google just to double check myself. In Alaska, the territory of a wolf pack is often 200 to 1,000 square miles.
Wow.
Yeah, and I think in like more prairie or Arctic areas, those territories are bigger. So like I bet the 1,000 square miles is kind of more like an Arctic wolf that's eating caribou, and it's got kind of vast expanses of like nothingness. And that 200, I've seen considerably less. I know with my own study animals in Alaska, we've got some wolves that are living on like 100 square mile islands that don't seem to leave the islands and go to other islands because they'll also do that. But yeah, it's a good question.
How many wolves pack typically or on average?
Yeah, on average, probably 6 or 7. So generally a pack consists of like a breeding pair. Historically, we'd call those the alphas. We've even wolf biologists have kind of moved away from that. But so we've got our breeding pair, and then there's usually pups of the year, and then some pups from last year. Most wolves will leave their family, their natal pack, around 2 years old. Some stick around, sometimes for their whole lives. Sometimes those wolves become breeders. Some just kind of seem to stick around as aunties and uncles, and not breed. But yeah, so that pack size can also change based on the prey type and that prey base as well. So you'll see bigger packs when you're in areas with like elk and bison and moose. And yeah, because you need a lot more wolves to take down a bison. Yeah. That is not a single wolf job versus like where I am in Alaska, where the deer are pretty small. The Sitka black-tailed deer that the wolves hunt up there is kind of their main prey animal. It's like 50 to 80 pounds. They're small deer, like border collie to lab sized.
Oh, that's small. That's really small.
Yeah, I mean, they're taller for sure. Yeah. But yeah, like if you've got a Great Dane, your dog is bigger than the deer that we have in Alaska. And the wolves are actually also smaller as well. Our wolves are, again, probably they're tall, but think more like large Labrador weight at least. And then yeah, maybe more like an Irish wolfhound in like height, because they've got legs for days.
That's pretty tall. That is.
They're very tall. They're very, very tall. Their legs are extraordinarily long, and their paws are huge. But yeah, so those wolves, like I'll call them my wolves in Alaska, even though obviously they're not mine, but I love them. A lot of our packs are like 4. We've got a couple that seem to be up into like the teens. One of the things, though, that we know from some longer term research studies is that a lot of times as they're kind of getting into the teens, what you're starting to see is a little bit of like fission fusion, where there might be 2 breeders, they might be maintaining 2 different den sites, but they still kind of all know each other. They all kind of get along. So it's kind of one pack, it's kind of 2. That actually, last I checked, was currently going on in Yellowstone, with the largest wolf pack in Yellowstone. I think it got up to like 30 animals, but they're starting to see like an increase in conflict, and there are kind of some camps going on between the wolves and those sorts of things. So it's all complicated and it's all very fluid as well. Like at the point in kind of October, the pack might be at its like peak size, where like the 2-year-olds haven't dispersed yet, the 1-year-olds are still around, and then the like 5-month-old puppies are also out and about. And then if you look maybe in March at that same pack, it might be quite a bit smaller because you've probably lost some of the pups over the winter, and some of those older dispersers have moved on, but they haven't had the next round of puppies.
Fascinating.
Yeah, it's all way more complicated than we think of.
So like if you have this pack and it needs like, let's say 200 square miles of habitat, will that overlap with a different pack's territory, or are there no overlaps?
There usually is a little bit of overlap kind of along the edges. But it kind of depends. Honestly, one of the things that we see in kind of looking at the globe right now is connectivity and fragmentation are really, really huge issues for most carnivores, because carnivores tend to need big territories. So I would bet that if you looked at, what we now call the United States in like 1300, there would be more wolf pack territories that overlapped slightly or touched at least than there are now in some ways. Although I could be wrong about that as well, because when packs are constricted into smaller and smaller spaces by the expansion of human dominated, anthropogenic landscapes, maybe that causes them to overlap each other more. I actually don't know. But yeah, they will overlap some. You also will have kind of dispersers at various points. Most dispersers, their goal is to find another disperser, set up a shack somewhere, have some puppies. But they'll be moving through the territories of other wolves as well as they go. And then kind of trying to find somewhere, a nook or cranny of uninhabited or less inhabited territory that they can set up on their own. But at any given point, they might be moving through somebody else's.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. And if we have or continue having livestock, like for example, in Oregon, if you wanted to, I don't know if there are wolves there.
There are, yeah.
So, and there's also a lot of livestock. So in that future that you imagine, that is like, you cannot have both the livestock and the wolves. Or is that at all possible?
It is. It is. And this is, not my area of expertise. There are a lot of like wolf biologists who like their whole thing is wolf, livestock, human interactions, depredations, those sorts of things. It is possible. Like we've had livestock, human beings have had livestock for thousands of years, tens of thousands of years. Wolves have been around for obviously that entire time as well. But yeah, coexistence is hard. Like there's a reason that we, white people got to North America and saw those wolves and were like, nah, no, we're not going to do that again. And like there was bounties on wolves and extermination. It is possible, but it's hard. It
Would
seems
it imply just accepting a certain quote unquote shrinkage? I think that's what they call it in the supermarket when I lift something.
Yeah, I think when I see coexistence with big carnivores done well, there is usually some amount of compensation program for farmers, so that if your calf gets killed by wolves, you're compensated for at least some amount of the value that calf represented to you. Those exactly how and how much of that is kind of beyond my knowledge at this point. But the goal is to kind of pay the farmers enough that extrajudicial killings of wolves don't make sense for them. Because part of it is you're just trying to keep them happy enough that they don't go and take things into their own hands with wolves. That is still a big problem. And historically was a lot worse. It's not uncommon for GPS collared wolves to go missing with poaching, basically.
Yeah.
But yes, it is possible. Some wolves and some wolf packs do seem capable of living around livestock and choosing not to depredate on livestock.
Really?
Yeah,
How do
but
they do we know why they seem to choose that?
I don't know. Maybe there's probably some ideas. I think in particular cattle, calves are only vulnerable to wolves for so many months a year, and then they do get to be much more challenging for wolves to take on. I think sheep and goats and like dairy cows, which are, smaller and daintier, do have a harder time.
Mhm.
And it does seem to be some amount of like a learned behavior as well. It does seem like there are some wolves that learn to take down livestock and then can become more problematic as well. Yeah, it is really challenging to figure out how to support this. And this is kind of where, again, so my bias is that in North America, a huge proportion of the free range livestock grazing
Mhm.
that happens in North America, particularly the United States. I guess I don't know as much in Canada, but it takes place on public land. It takes place on National Forest land and Bureau of Land Management land. Those grazing permits are subsidized.
Mhm.
And then we are, having livestock degrade the landscape of our public lands. And then the wolves that other people would like to be on those public lands are punished, are killed for killing the livestock that are free range on the public lands. So
Mhm.
what I would like to see, again, I'd like to see less livestock.
Yeah.
Period. Because I'd rather have bison than livestock, and that's actually a current issue in the United States. I've read a little bit about this, but I'm not super well spoken on it. But there have been some shenanigans, unfortunately, lately where grazing permits for bison herds have been getting pulled and revoked in
Mhm.
favor of grazing permits for cow herds.
Mhm.
And there's a lot of mess around that. And personally, I feel that if livestock is being grazed on public lands, and you're getting that subsidized, then as a fellow public lands owner myself, and we can get into like the colonialism of that as well, but given that that's where we're at, I say, okay, well, I'm willing to accept your loss of livestock when you are grazing them on our lands in order for there to be wolves around. And people disagree on that, obviously. I guess one other thing, going back to the like wolf livestock conflict, I don't even know if it's conflict. It's just wolves doing what wolves do, and they've got nowhere else to go and nothing else to eat. There are deterrent options. Livestock guardian dogs do a great job. Fencing can do a good job. Corralling your livestock during high risk times. So kind of late summer is a high risk time because that's kind of when the wolves are hungriest. The pups are biggest, but not helpful in hunting yet.
Mhm.
And also, obviously, when the calves or lambs or kids are really young,
Yeah.
making sure that they're protected. Then there are a lot of things that can be done that can dramatically reduce livestock loss to wolves. And I think starting there is a great step, compensating farmers when they do lose things. But again, personally, I'm looking at like if you're on public lands, yeah, this is where I will probably not end up getting hired as a wolf biologist for the federal government, because I don't think that I would be able to juggle all of the different stakeholders the way that would be necessary for that job, because my biases are, I think, a little too strongly in favor of the wolves and the natural land, and not nearly sympathetic enough towards farmers.
Okay, let me ask you something else that I'm sure you have thought about, and
Yeah.
I have very little knowledge of. So ideally, we just wouldn't do livestock anymore. Is that realistic for
No.
us as a
No, of course
no?
not. Yeah, it's one of those things that's really easy to say. I mean, maybe it is.
No, I mean, like, is it possible?
Yeah.
Let's say, is it possible?
Is it possible?
Can we just stop eating livestock and then we don't have to keep livestock anymore? But can we feed ourselves that way?
Yeah, I don't know. Maybe we could move further down the food chain. And I think certainly eating a lot less would go a long way for us. Yeah, I mean,
less meat is what you mean.
less meat. Yeah. I think there are probably ways to dramatically reduce the pressure on the landscape. And like Earth is a finite resource, just like literally space is a finite resource on this planet. And if we want to have, what are we at, 7 billion people now, 8 billion people, and if we all want to be eating a burger a day, which I know is not what everybody actually wants, but like if we're all eating meat at high rates, and we're feeding that livestock supplementary grain, and therefore we need space for the grain. Yeah, that's really challenging to figure out how to make that space actually happen. I would like to see, and I think we are seeing people being more open-minded to other protein sources for themselves. I personally, I'm pescatarian. I try to be pretty picky about the fish that I'll eat. And I eat crickets. There's a Mexican grocery where I can get chapulines from Oaxaca, which I'm very excited about. I think there are probably ways to more sustainably and ethically have chickens than pigs and cattle in particular. I think, we can also get into like cognition and welfare for the farm animals as well, which we haven't even touched on. But yeah, like, is it realistic to just... No, I don't think so. I think like livestock are so integral to modern humans that it would be a crazy lift. It's kind of like AI, like only it's been around for like tens of thousands of years, and said there's no way to put that genie back in the bottle. As much as like I don't love AI, but like we're not getting rid of it now. And I think it's even less realistic to imagine that we could actually cease livestock, but maybe there's a way to like not have them on public lands, not have large scale farming, not have factory farming, some combination of those. I think would be good for especially if we're looking at the more than human world. I think that would be a net good when you take into account the opinions of the cows and the wolves and the trees and the grasses and everybody else out there. Not just
that's convincing to me. Yeah.
I mean, and again, it's not like there's no comprehensive policy argument there, which is super frustrating.
No, there's not, but like I'm just curious.
Yeah.
So, and you mentioned our current population, and I think you said it's not really sustainable the way it is. But like, would it be sustainable if we did move away from eating all that meat and growing all the crops to feed all that meat that we then eat?
I don't know.
Are we way overshot anyways?
I don't know. I've heard so much about, the amount of food that we currently waste. And if we synthesize our systems better to reduce food waste, I think that there's probably a way for this population number to be somewhere in the range of sustainable. I don't know whether, I've heard all sorts of different numbers of what people who have thought about this for like an entire doctorate think the number is realistically for like long-term sustainability. And I think it also, obviously it's not just the raw number of people, but how we're living on this planet. And that's, kind of going back to the root of your question about livestock. I don't know. I think there's a lot of things that we can do to reduce the per capita impact on the planet. And, realistically now, getting back to like politics, we also need to be thinking about like gajillionaires and how they're probably as much of the problem as like, I don't know, like Taylor Swift's personal jet is probably as much of a problem as like the amount of meat that like any given state consumes in a period of, like, I don't know. There's probably ways to slice and dice that and say that there are certainly individual human beings who are definitely part of the problem. And, I mean, we're all a little bit of the part of the problem, but I think if we didn't have any billionaires, that would probably do an awful lot towards making this population more sustainable for the rest of, for the rest of us.
Yeah.
If we didn't have, 0.001% of the people hoarding,
Yeah.
whatever percentage it is today of all of the resources.
That's such a good point. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Because I don't think that like the goat herder in Kenya is like a problem the same way as, a mega factory farm that is slashing and burning the Brazilian rainforest is the same problem, is the same way that like us, even a medium-sized ranch is in Montana, where, I'd rather have free-ranging bison in Montana, but if we can't have that, there are some ways that you can kind of argue that cattle being on the landscape can mimic. They don't eat the same way as bison and they don't move the same way as bison, so it's not really the same thing. But that landscape did evolve to have herbivores on it.
Mm-hmm.
I'd rather have bison than cattle, but I also don't get to pick. I don't know, so it's really hard to like. One of the things politically that I'm sure you understand, I'm sure most of our listeners understand as well, because I think we've all lived through this, is like, I think you can hear a lot of like frustration and hesitancy in my voice around a lot of this, because I'm like, what is feasibly under my control? What do I care about the most? And then how can I spend enough time and effort learning enough about that I can speak intelligently about it? And I love that you're asking me these questions as we go, but I'm also like, God, I don't know. Like, I feel like I need to spend 3 years reading all the literature on each of these questions in order to come up with like a comprehensive policy and even understanding of like, yeah, is 8 billion people sustainable? Is 8 billion people sustainable if we all eat way less meat? Is 8 billion people sustainable if we eat less meat and there are no billionaires? Or maybe either or, like, I don't know. And, like as a doctorate student, it's so funny because I'm like, I can tell you all day about like what, a couple hundred wolves in Alaska are doing and what they're eating and who they're related to. And, what a given local fisherman thinks about the sea otters and all sorts of stuff. And I think that's like, I think that comes back to the, like, I like expertise, and I am very willing to be wrong. And I'm really, really willing to like listen to other people who say that like, it's actually more complicated than that. Or actually, 8 billion people might be sustainable if we reduce food waste, which is like, this was a conversation my partner and I were just having where I was, getting kind of grouchy about the number of people and what that means for wild spaces. And, my own personal love of like being alone in the woods and how that feels harder and harder and harder to do. And part of that is also remote work, which is great. I take advantage of that, but it makes it easier for us to all move towards more and more beautiful places and then impact those beautiful places more and more. And anyway, we were talking about this and, he pointed out this food waste thing and he was like, well, it might not be as much the number of people as you think it is, as also just better moving our resources around. And I was like, oh, right. Okay. I guess I'm maybe a little bit wrong about that, probably.
I mean, it's different pieces of the puzzle.
Right.
I don't know which pieces of the puzzle are the largest ones.
Yeah. I think what I would like to see, kind of going back to like this political vision, is more power in the hands of more people, more equity or equality. I kind of forget the difference at this exact moment in decision making, and more empowerment towards more decision makers that supports more policy experts who maybe are less influenced by capital and the people with the deepest pockets, which is, kind of going back to this like livestock grazing on federal lands in the United States. Like, that is really heavily impacted by the interests of the moneyed few. And I would love to see more people who have had the ability to research this much, much more deeply than I have more actual policy impact and not be constantly running into really intense strong arm negotiation, lobbying, etc. from the wealthy. I think a lot of things would be a lot better off for that. And actually, so this is a little bit of like a pivot, but it's on this question of like wolves and consent equity, the commons maybe. So there's this thing I've been thinking about a lot in Alaska, where so I study these wolves. They live on islands. There are a couple communities in the area. There's like a couple thousand people who live on the island of Prince of Wales, which is the big island that I'm kind of largely based on, and then I survey primarily the islands that are out into the Pacific from there. And there are a couple people who still are trappers. And they can go to Alaska Department of Fish and Game, and they can get their trapping license, and they can set their trap lines. And, it's a historical way of life. It's hard work. And yeah, I've always had some kind of like icky feelings about trapping because it's indiscriminate. You don't know which individuals you're removing. Wolves, as we were talking about, have these like highly complex social systems, and you don't know when you're setting trap lines if you're going to remove the breeding female or remove a pup of last year, and like those have dramatically different impacts on the population. Okay, so there's all these like icky feelings that I've always had about trapping, and I've really tried to be open-minded. I talk to people daily basically when I'm in Alaska who are trappers. A lot of them are trapping like martens and other much smaller animals. But so then I was thinking about this the other day, where there's a given guy who has kind of taken it upon himself over the however many years to try to keep the wolf population down on a given island so that people can take their boats out there during hunting season and harvest deer more easily. Because if you keep the wolf population down, especially on these islands, usually predator control like this doesn't actually work super duper well, but in these islands it actually kind of can, because you've got like a semi-closed system where you kind of can just like remove the predators, and then the deer population will generally do a little bit better because there are fewer wolves around. And I was just thinking about it the other day in this framework of like consent. And so he can just get this permit, and he can go and he can set his trap lines, and he can do that. It's legal, it's allowed. There is no way for me to say, hey, actually, I really like going to that island and seeing the wolves there. Mm-hmm. Like, his decision to trap is always going to supersede mine. And there's this like issue. I mean, it's, can kind of say the same thing about livestock grazing. There's lots of areas that I love recreating with my dogs that have free range livestock. And I would love to not have livestock there. I would love to have natural herbivores and native herbivores instead. I'd love to not be concerned about like steers running around near my dogs or whatever. But there's no way for us to really do that right now, because if I say, hey, I don't want trapping on a given island, that's just not the way that our permits are structured. It's, you would have to completely change the designation of the land protection of that island, or, declare it some sort of protected area. And like, I've been thinking about this through the lens of there's one island where I'm rather particularly fond of the wolves on that island. They've got a couple distinctive looking ones. There's one black one. We've seen these wolves several times. We've heard the puppies howling, which is very cute. Yeah. Actually, if you want, I can play that audio in a moment, just because it's really cool. So I'm really fond of these wolves. They're doing quite well. There's a lot of them on this island. We think there's about 13 on an island that's like 144 square miles, which is a huge density of wolves. Mm-hmm. And, I'm nervous for them. I'm nervous that nobody's currently trapping on the island right now, because trapping's a lot of work and there's only so many people who trap. And like, there's something that doesn't quite feel right to me about the idea that like two people can have completely different opinions about something, but as long as somebody else gets the permit and does it even by the books, there's still no way for my opinion on it to register, to matter. If I tampered with his trap lines, I get in trouble. Mm-hmm. So I don't. And even like if somebody were to do it illegally, if they were to poach, like, people rarely get caught, they rarely get punished in a way that actually really like matters. Yeah. But so like, but even leaving the poaching aside, I don't know. I've just been like really stuck on this idea of like consent and whose opinion matters in these these areas that ostensibly are public lands, and that even sets aside like whether or not how many people have said that they don't want oil drilling in the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge, and it doesn't matter. But this trapping thing is just like a funny little microcosm of it. I don't know. I've been thinking about it a lot.
The trapping, what do, like, someone who has a trapping permit, do they make a living being a trapper, or is that a pastime that's just a tradition they want to keep alive because their great grandparents did it?
I think a little bit of both, a little bit of all of it. Certainly you can sell like a wolf pelt for an amount of money. It doesn't seem like they're selling very well right now. Like, I can tell you that there are a couple places, local stores or whatever, that you go into, and there's been the same wolf pelt hanging up there for the last 3 years for sale. I mean, they're expensive. So I think it's more kind of, at least in the cases of the individuals that I know. And this is also a little different maybe from people who are like way out in the Yukon, who really are like living in a cabin. And not that these guys don't. They do live off the land way more than most of us, but nobody's eating wolves. It's really more kind of tradition, to my understanding, and generally the way it's described to me, even by the trappers themselves, is population control of the wolves. They want fewer wolves.
And the reason they want fewer wolves is because they themselves want to eat the deer?
Correct.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah, and and I will say as well, like, most people, maybe not most, but many people in Alaska live much more hand to mouth than I think many of us are used to. Food is insanely expensive up there. Like, protein that you hunt or fish yourself is hugely important for people up there in a way that I think, like, I grew up in a hunting family in Wisconsin, and that's like kind of a pastime. Like, yes, we ate the deer that my dad shot, but like, it was different for sure than Alaska. And I do want to give people some grace for that. But, then, kind of getting back to like systemic issues, because I think I'm somebody who, like, maybe this is a good, like, something to underline, is that like, I'm always going back to these systemic issues. And like, where I work in Alaska, we've lost in some places up to 94% of our high value old growth stands, which are super important deer habitat during snowy winters. They're also really important for salmon spawning and those sorts of things. And way back in the 80s, scientists were already starting to say that, hey, if we keep clear cutting, we're going to see a massive reduction in the carrying capacity for deer in this area. And carrying capacity being like the number of deer that the landscape can support. And that's what people are starting to see. It is getting harder, it seems, for people to find deer and fill their freezers. And that is a problem for people. And that is a real problem. But then the solution that is most accessible to at least some people is to, okay, so we'll trap the wolves, we'll knock the wolves back, then we can get the deer, when the problem is actually the logging. And in many cases, it's the logging that happened in the 90s. So there's no way to undo it. And these old growth forests in Alaska where I work are non-renewable on, it takes 200 to 500 years, depending on kind of who you ask and what you're looking at, for these forests to regain like a mature, complex, high value old growth characteristics. So, this logging that peaked in the 80s, 90s, and early 2000s are not, we're not going to see them coming back to what they used to be in our lifetimes.
Yeah. I think it is very important to keep coming back to the systemic issues, or to ask ourselves, what is the systemic issue behind it, right? Rather than necessarily getting mad at the individual. But yeah, also, well, let's play your wolf soundtrack if you found it.
Oh, yes. Okay. And there's a little bit of whispering on the humans are conversing, because so we were supposed to go to this den site last week, and collect all of the scats because we want to know what the wolf pups are eating in particular. So we wanted to go visit this den site to know where the den site is, because then actually we can log that location privately. It's not public knowledge because people make bad decisions when they know where wolf dens are. But then there are some protections that are afforded to den sites based on, as far as like logging restrictions and some of those sorts of things. Those restrictions are pretty weak right now, but they're actually hopefully going to get upped soon. Alaska Department of Fish and Game folks are working on that with the Forest Service. But anyway, knowing where the den is important, because then it can get protected, even if those protections currently are kind of weak. Then also for my research, it's really interesting to know what the wolves are choosing to feed the puppies. So anyway, historically, what we've always seen in this area, but knowledge is really limited, is that wolf packs in this area have always been off of the den site by July 4th. And they've known that by having collared individuals, GPS collars. So they've known that, like, okay, by July 4th, they've reliably moved the puppies onto what they call a rendezvous site, which is where the pups kind of hang out as they're starting to learn to follow the pack around over the next several months. And they'll kind of hang out at rendezvous sites through like October or so. So we go on July 10th and we stop maybe 600-700 meters away from the den site, and we howl to make sure that they're not home. And they immediately howled back. And you can hear adults, you can hear subadults, you can hear puppies, which is very cool. Every time I hear wolves howling, I cry. It's so cool to be able to like, oh, at them. And my wolf howl when I'm actually really trying is a little bit better than that, but not much better. And have them reply. It's magical. It's so cool. And also, we had been on a boat for like 2 hours and then like borrowed ATVs from some locals and like ATV'd in, and we'd left the dogs behind because we don't bring the dogs into active den sites or den sites really at all if we can avoid it. And then they were still home like a week longer than they should have been. So I'm a little annoyed at these wolves right now because we had to leave and come back later. So hopefully we'll go in another couple weeks and hopefully they'll have moved on by then. But yeah, well, it's pretty cool. It's always really, really cool to like get to hear them. And we didn't see them this time, but a lot of times when you howl, when you're that close to the den, they'll pop up and kind of look at you, and they're not aggressive, shockingly. Like people in other research studies where this is important, they will actually go in and handle the pups, get weights, maybe check temperatures, teeth, whatever they need to do for like that research. And there's always a trade-off with that, right? Obviously that causes stress to the parents, causes stress to the puppies. We don't do it for my work because it's not necessary, but there are times where that's justifiable. Anyway, even when people are like belly crawling into a wolf den and pulling the puppies out, the parents will like stand around and bark at you. Really? And they're upset, but they don't attack, which is crazy. Because they will attack bears that try to kill their pups, but not people, apparently.
That is wild.
It's wild. It sounds
bigger, or are you talking about very small bears?
They're small bears. I mean, but they're still bigger than me. But yeah, like we actually were at this den site like maybe a month ago as well, kind of in like mid-June. And we howled, and we did have them pop up. We actually had, there was a couple teenage wolves. So like the 1.5-year-olds from last year popped up and like were peering around the bushes and looking at us. And it's funny, they act very similar to street dogs. Or like if you've ever worked with like a shelter dog that's like a little affiliative, but very unsure of you. So they were like 100 meters away from us, and they're like peering at us, and you can see they've kind of got like a high, slow tail wag that they're like not quite sure what's going on, and they'll like kind of peer forwards, and like one of them will be a bit braver and come out and look at us, and then it'll like scamper back real quick behind its sibling. It's so cool. It's so cool to watch. They really are. I mean, they're like dogs are wolves. They're not in some really, really important ways, but they also are in a lot of ways.
That is so cool. I'm really surprised that the researchers can pick up the pups and the wolves will just observe and be slightly injured, but not. That is really, really.
And the crazy thing is also like we have put up a camera trap, 50 or 100 meters from a wolf den, and the wolves have left the den. So like they're really, really sensitive in some ways. And it seems to also be kind of individual wolf dependent, individual population dependent. These wolves here, where I work in Alaska, get a lot of pressure from humans. They're hunted, they're trapped, and they have been hunted and trapped more or less continuously. Versus, I think, when you look at some of the Mexican wolf and like red wolf research, those wolves have been protected for a really long time. A lot of them probably were handled themselves as puppies, because that's like they're under such intensive reintroduction management efforts that it seems like there's maybe a little bit less effect in some situations just because of the difference in kind of fear and pressure that those wolves have regarding people. Because I would be shocked if you could handle the wolves where I work in Alaska without them abandoning the den. But they apparently are able to in other populations. Because again, a camera trap will get our wolves to abandon a den.
Yeah.
And it's crazy. We've even talked to people other researchers who will put up a camera in November at a den site that was used last year. And you will see on the camera in February when they're starting to kind of do a little bit of house shopping, figure out where they're going to have their pups that year. They will stop moving, stare up at the camera, tuck tail and run. Wow. Even if the camera, sometimes where, people are putting them 12, 15 feet up in a tree and pointing it down at the den to try to make it less obtrusive. And these cameras are silent. There's no flash, and they're still obviously able to detect it, and they will get spooked and they will not den there. It's really, really hard to get a camera on a den site without it's that the Heisenberg principle in physics where it's impossible to observe a phenomenon without influencing it. We see that.
Oh, is it the cat thing, right? Schrodinger's cat?
Maybe.
Where you don't know if the cat is dead or alive, the cat in the box?
Yeah, that's Schrodinger's cat. Okay, no, it is the Heisenberg uncertainty principle. And I'm reading the AI overview, but I think this is what I was remembering. You cannot simultaneously know the exact position and the exact momentum, speed, and direction of a subatomic particle. The more precisely you measure one of these properties, the less precisely you know the other. So, yeah. Popularized by Breaking Bad.
Oh, right.
Yeah, that was. But yeah, it's really hard to study the natural world.
Interesting. So how well these wolves in Alaska learned that humans are not to be trusted.
Yeah, and it's interesting actually. The bears, so bears are also pretty heavily hunted up there, because they've got really big black bears that people like to hunt for. Bear sausage, I guess, is fine. It's kind of greasy, not for me. But whatever. People like hunting bears, and the bears seem to know that you're not allowed to shoot them from a boat. So as long as you're in a boat, we've been within 100 meters of a mama bear and her cubs, and they'll just keep eating. They'll flip rocks and be hunting for gunnelfish and whatever. Totally ignore us. But as soon as you're on land, they turn tail and run.
Fascinating.
Yeah, they do seem to know, and I'm sure there's some poaching from boats. It's Alaska, it's pretty easy to do stuff without being detected, but the bears are much, much, much more comfortable with you on a boat. As soon as you're on foot, they're very worried about you, which is just, and I don't know how that's passed on, because I don't know how many bears individually had a bad experience.
Yeah. That
would have taught them that. But I guess, it just takes a couple moms to teach that lesson, and it'll spread.
But also interesting. So the rule is to make it a little bit harder for people to decimate the bear population, and that's why you are not allowed to hunt them from a boat, or what?
Yeah, generally you're not allowed in North America. You're basically never, I think, allowed to shoot from a vehicle.
And a boat's a vehicle.
And a boat's a vehicle. Yeah, that would be my guess as to where it all comes from.
So it may come from urban laws rather than.
Yeah, I think it still is kind of a fairness. I don't know, actually. I should look into it, but I'm not 100% sure exactly where and why that comes about.
Very interesting. I wanted to ask you, that's also a big question, but are you taking concrete actions to move your community or legislation or
Yeah.
in the
Yeah.
direction that you'd like change to happen in?
Yeah, so what am I doing within my own community? You know, there's been a couple really cool concrete steps I've been able to take that I've been really enjoying. I think the most concrete one that I've been able to take recently is I joined a medics collective. So I'm a wilderness first responder. I was an EMT briefly. I don't have a current EMT certification. And kind of a little bit of a medical nerd. Again, going back to my sister being a doctor, I guess, again, there's still some overlap there. But so this medics collective, we are in the process of trying to work out a better way to do direct outreach with the unhoused community and provide things like wound care to the unhoused community. So we're working on partnering with some other folks that already have good inroads and relationships with those communities, because it's, you know, it's not something to like take lightly and just like waltz in and offer help. So we're in the process of that. It's all relatively like newly formed and kind of young. And it came about originally, this collective was much more focused on like protest medicine, or action medics is kind of what they're called. So, you know, originally we kind of all got together to like help wash tear gas out of people's eyes at protests. And we do some of that as well, but where we are specifically in Corvallis doesn't really get like tear gas the way that they do in Portland and also in Eugene, which is like 45 minutes to an hour south of us. So, you know, trying to figure out better ways to actually serve our community rather than just like, I think the action medics, the protest medics is like pretty sexy, pretty cool. Everybody wants to do it. But, you know, figuring out like, okay, but what's actually like really needed in our community. So that's been a big thing. I'm really excited about it. It's, you know, it's slow going. We're all like stretched super thin, but I'm really, really proud of like being part of that group, and I'm excited to see where we're going to go. And then, you know, I like to think that most of my work around like working dogs and conservation, you know, I think it's all political, right? Like there's no way for me to talk about wolves without talking about logging, and there's no way to talk about logging without talking about policy, and there's no way to talk about that without talking about your representatives. And then there's maybe no way to talk about that without talking about whether or not we want you know, or what sort of representation we want, because, you know, I don't think that like I'm not saying that we all should have like a perfectly direct, like I don't personally want to be voting on like every single subcategory. I mean, kind of going back to what we were talking about earlier with expertise, like I don't actually want to be in charge of that. So anyway, yeah, I think those are kind of the main things right now. I think one of the things that's been really strange about this political moment, and I know a lot of people have been, this is something I talk about all the time with other people in the US right now, is that it feels like there's so many things that we're all really worried and angry and upset about, you know, with Iran and Palestine and ICE and, you know, climate change and this and that and the other thing, that I think it's kind of shocking to me that people aren't like rioting more, or like that there doesn't seem to be more going on. I think everybody is feeling stretched thin, pulled in a lot of different directions, and kind of waiting to see what's going to happen, because particularly as we look at like what has gone on with like the US Voting Rights Act and gerrymandering and the Supreme Court going like so extreme in so many ways right now, it's hard to imagine that we are going to like vote our way out of this, or that it is going to just like, oh, we'll elect a Democrat in 2028 and it'll all go back to normal. I don't think even like my relatively like milquetoast liberal parents believe that sort of thing anymore. I think they're much more hopeful about it than I am. But yeah, so I think all of that is to say there's also like, I feel like a lot of space in my life right now. I mean, there's very little actual space in my life right now. I'm so busy, but there's a lot of me alongside a lot of other people kind of thinking about like, okay, what are the skills or things that we can do to prepare for if and when things go south, you know, whether that's like personal preparedness as far as like having water jugs and canned food around in case there's a wildfire and having a go bag ready and like making sure we're ready to go in case something goes really south for us. And our community, how do we care for our community? And then also kind of being ready for like, what are things going to be looking like politically over the next couple of years, and what is going to change? Because I think there's a lot of things that people are really, really upset about right now, and whether things go well during the primary and the elections or not, I think there's still like a lot of really hard work to be done, and I'm not entirely sure like where I'm going to end up falling as like what is useful for me to do within these next several years, but definitely trying to figure out what I need to do as far as like, again, like these medical classes. I've been thinking about joining the local search and rescue organization as well. I really don't have time for it, but like figuring out, you know, I think it's an ism that we all hear, we've all heard, I'm sure, of like looking at like, what does your community need? What are you good at? What do you like? And like focusing within that. And like for me, that certainly comes in on, you know, conservation biology and animal rights, immigration justice, and all of those really come back to, for me, feeling really comfortable working on, you know, both ecological policy, hopefully, and things like taking care of other people in the woods, you know, the wilderness first responders sort of stuff, search and rescue sort of stuff. But, you know, yeah, a lot of it is still very like, I don't know.
No, I mean, I think right now at this point in time, none of us really do. But yeah, like I think the important thing is not to get paralyzed by just not knowing or not having the perfect answer for everything. But yeah, I mean, I think those are actually three very good questions, right?
Yeah.
What are you good at? What does the community need? And what do you like?
Yeah. Yeah. And, you know, and I think also, you know, going back to where we first started here, thinking about, I think taking care of yourself and your immediate community, and then your slightly broader community, and then slightly broader, like makes a lot of sense. And, you know, for me right now, a huge part of that is like, you know, training my dogs well so that they and I have capacity to go out and enjoy natural spaces and, you know, not be obtrusive to anybody else or the wildlife that are in those spaces. And like, you know, I think I don't want to like let people off the hook for, you know, like don't change your Instagram picture to a black square and think you're done with racial justice, obviously, but also, you know, we can think about like how we train our dogs and how we and our dogs interact with the world as action, as advocacy, not just for ourselves and for them, but also for the natural world, also for other dogs. Yeah, and like how to interact with the rest of the world with respect and care, I think really, really tightly ties back into dog training, for, you know, to kind of bring it all home for us.
No, yeah, I love that. I love that tie, and I agree. Yeah, like
Yeah.
how I interact with my dog has an impact on how my dog and I interact with the world around us. And that, yeah, it's like a snowball.
Yeah.
That's
Yeah.
so true.
And, you know, I can't necessarily, yeah, well, there's a lot of nuances to like how dogs interact with nature, and how to do that well. But like, you know, you can really start with like small things and keep in mind how important they are. Like, you know, making sure you pick up your dog's poop when you're at a trail. Like, it's so basic and it's so small, but like I always try to leave with more dog poop than my dogs produced on a given trail, because like I want dogs to continue being allowed on those trails. And that means that like, yeah, it's annoying that somebody else didn't pick up after their dog, but like, who knows, maybe they brought 2 poop bags and their dog pooped 3 times. Like it,
Oh, like I feel like, yeah, like
I've done it.
Yeah, no, that it happens all the time, or it's the last one and you don't realize.
Yeah.
That it's the last.
Yeah. You just throw your treat pouch on, not realizing that you ran out of bags last week. Like,
Yeah.
I mean, and I know, you know, That's probably not the case every time, but I like kind of choose to believe it as much as I can. And, you know, yeah. And if we want to continue being able to take our dogs off leash in nature, then it's our responsibility to make sure our dogs aren't harassing wildlife or harassing other recreationists. And, you know I've lived in a lot of different places. I have a lot of different like levels of accessibility for dogs and their access to nature. And I like a huge part of why I don't think I'll move back to Denver, Colorado is because there is so much nature and it is so wonderful. And I love, 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 love Colorado. But the off-leash opportunities are extremely limited. Most trails don't even allow flexi leads, technically. I've never known anybody to actually get a ticket for it. Or which, you know, long leads, they want 6-foot leads. As somebody with 3 dogs, that is really, really hard. And I think those sorts of rules come around partially when the dog owning community does not steward things well.
Yeah.
You know, and what we as like gigantic dog nerds can do is like obviously lead by example, and then also, yeah, like offer classes, you know, help other people. And maybe, you know, if it is getting to be a problem in your area, this is something I've thought about a lot. So like Boulder, Colorado has a off-leash licensing program where you can take your dog through a class and kind of get signed off, and then they get a special tag that goes on their collar, and then they're allowed to be off-leash in some of these areas. There are other areas that are off-leash to more dogs, and some areas that are, you know, you still have to have your dog on leash because maybe it's like sensitive nesting habitat for a bird or whatever it is. And, you know, having seen that model, I prefer to not need a license to have my dog off leash, but I would rather need a license than to not be able to take my dogs off leash at all. Yeah. So like, that's something that I'm always kind of watching for in like local legislation where I'm living is like, if there starts to be some sort of like murmuring around legislation to reduce access for dogs, having seen a model that is a compromise, particularly like is something that I'm certainly ready to advocate for if and when it comes up wherever I'm living, because I've currently lived somewhere with really wonderful off-leash access for dogs, but it's just one really poorly behaved dog incident away from that suddenly becoming the conversation and getting taken away from all of us.
Do you think that is happening more and more? Like,
I don't know. It's more and more. I mean, like, I guess over the grand scheme of time, sure. Because yeah, like I think historically, you know, we don't have to look all that far in the past in the US for dogs to have had a lot more autonomy and freedom of movement than they do now. Cell phones probably don't help as far as like the ability to capture things and have them go viral. And then, you know, and I think accountability is important. You know, I saw somebody, this was maybe a year ago, but at a park I walk my dogs at every day. Her dog was off leash and ran up and killed a squirrel, caught a squirrel, and the dog did it quickly and effectively enough. I highly doubt that was the dog's first time doing it. The lady was just still on her phone, didn't really do anything about it. You know, it was one of those moments where I was like, I'm having an emotional reaction to that. That is, you know, if I weren't personally so invested in my dogs also being able to have access off leash to this multi-use park, it would be very reasonable for somebody to make a big stink over that person's behavior regarding what they were allowing their dog to do.
Yeah.
And yeah, I you know, like I think accountability is important there. And I think that's where rules, I guess, have a place, you know, which is like always a funny thing to say as an anarchist, where you're like, yeah, I guess there are rules. Of course there are rules. Like we owe each other respect and dignity, and like that squirrel deserves to be able to live in the fucking park. And that dog deserves to be able to like move its body and do fun things, but like, you know, that probably doesn't supersede the squirrel's, you know, life.
That's an interesting point.
Yeah. Yeah, and I'm not wholeheartedly against hunting, obviously, or hunting with dogs. And like I'm pretty pro rodent control terriers in areas that need them, whether it's a huge urban area or granaries or I know conservation dogs that are used to reduce rodent populations. Usually, the dogs are not the ones doing the killing in conservation, but they are finding rodents for removal in like areas that endangered seabirds nest, where like a couple rodents can really decimate the population.
And you can't have the terriers who would themselves decimate the population work there, because they would also go for the seabirds.
No, so a lot of people do use terriers for this, actually. Yeah, I talked to Miriam Ritchie, who's out of New Zealand, on my podcast about this a while ago. But generally the standard of practice is to have the terriers muzzled and not actually doing the killing themselves, but you're leveraging their instincts to like find the rats, go to ground, locate them, and then you can place your traps or whatever it is. There are people, again, who do have the dogs actually killing the rats, but I think generally that's kind of frowned upon. And my understanding of that, obviously as somebody who, this is not exactly my world, but my understanding of that is that there's kind of this concern that if you do that and then there's a mistake, the dog gets over aroused or confused or training slips or if you're allowing them to kill the rodents and then they come across, I don't know, a baby echidna, a baby bird, whatever it is, there's more likely of like a really bad outcome there. I think it's also kind of a perception thing. Sometimes invasive species mitigation, removal efforts, in general can be a little challenging for people emotionally, less so generally with rats. But when you get into like invasive foxes or feral cats and those sorts of things, mitigation and removal efforts can get really, really emotional for people.
No, I'm surprised that the terriers are generally muzzled. But also,
Yeah.
like, I mean, I'm clearly not in that world, but I would assume that the terrier, if the terrier wasn't muzzled, the terrier would kill whatever it could that was the right size, basically.
Yeah.
Either way,
When I
right?
talked to Miriam about it, she talked about training them from a really young age on kind of specifically what their quarry was. And that kind of blew my mind, honestly, because it hadn't really occurred to me that that was a thing that you could do. But I guess it's kind of like, you do the same thing with a border collie, right? You give it a good outlet to herd sheep or herd its ball, and it might be less likely to shadow chase. And I guess historically, if you think about having hunting dogs, terriers, etc., you want to be able to like know what your quarry is, and go after your target. So I guess it does make sense that we've managed to breed them to do that. I just hadn't previously realized it was possible. And I suspect it's one of those things that's a little bit of a lost art on most of us, because so few people actually use terriers for what they're bred for. With good reason.
No, I totally, but like what surprises me is that the use of the terrier for what they were originally bred for doesn't go all the way to allowing them to actually do the.
Yeah, I think that's largely a compromise, because I think people are already uncomfortable with the idea of having, or some stakeholders or whatever are already kind of uncomfortable with the idea of having a terrier go into like an endangered seabird nesting colony and trying to find the rats. So making sure that, you as the handler can say like, no, the dog is muzzled and the dog does not kill the rats, for better or for worse, I suppose, kind of creates at least the perception that is more palatable and more safe for people to sign off on. And I guess that makes sense. I don't know. Again, not really my world. Other than like it's dogs and it's conservation, so it's my world. But I'm like, it's so different from what I do finding poop.
But also interesting, and I'll let you go in a second. But like that brings me back to the person you observed whose dog killed a squirrel. Because in a way, like a squirrel is a rodent, right? As far as I know. Yeah.
Sciuridae. I think they're rodents.
And urban squirrels are very. I mean, there's a lot. At least where I am in Mexico City, there's a huge population of urban squirrels.
Sure. Yeah.
A lot. So, like technically, like that, like, squirrel is not an endangered species.
Yeah.
Basically, it's not that far removed from the rat, right? So, like, it's not. The problem with this dog killing the squirrel is really the perception by other people.
Yeah, I guess. Yes, I think for me to feel comfortable with like killing a wild animal, there needs to be a purpose to it. And when it's like, okay, these rats are invasive, they wouldn't be here without us, and they're harming, they're killing gajillions of albatross eggs or whatever it is, then okay, I feel like comfortable with removal or mitigation efforts. But yeah, again, this is like where we could have a whole separate conversation around invasive species, because like you can make the same argument for, there are a lot of ecologists and conservationists who are pretty strongly anti-trap neuter release for cats, because you're still releasing that cat out to kill birds. I personally get real squirmy with the idea of just trapping and killing stray cats, though. Like, even though I'm like, as an ecologist, I see where that comes from, but like, man, I have a hard time with that one. And yeah, the squirrels, I don't know. I guess like if that squirrel was problematic in some way and it was targeted, I would feel more comfortable with it versus it just kind of being like incidental. That feels unfair. Like if it were a baby bunny, which also are doing okay. We've got Eurasian cottontails for the most part here. They're not actually native at all.
I mean, it depends on where you look too, right? You just mentioned New Zealand. I think Australia and New Zealand have like, don't they have like rabbit problems?
They have huge rabbit, cat, and fox problems. Hawaii's got invasive mongoose. Like, it gets really, really challenging. I do have to go. But yeah, we could talk about invasive species. And this is definitely not I keep saying it's not my area of expertise, because I guess that's my line now as a researcher. But it's complicated. And figuring out, and I think the thing is, like, genuinely reasonable people can disagree, and maybe that's like having space for other people to have their own thoughts and feelings and autonomous decisions, while also like seeking consensus and consent in what we decide to do about these complicated problems is, I guess, basically the vision that I have. I don't know how to do it, but that's the idea.
Yes, that would be the goal. Yeah.
Well, thank you for having me on. This was really fun.
Thank you so much for coming on. This took, we talked longer than I thought we would, and I'll let you go in a second. Quickly shout out Barley's Patreon, where people can donate.
Yeah, thank you. So that's donorbox.com/barley-lymphoma. And we can get that link. I will send you, I've already sent you the wolves howling, so you can throw that in whenever you want. And I'll send you that episode I did with the terrier, Lady Miriam. It was super interesting. She's very well spoken and clearly like a deep thinker about such things, and definitely a terrier expert, which is cool. I'm like in the herding and sporting dog world, and I'm like, oh yeah, I guess people are experts in terriers the same way other people are experts in border collies.
Of course they are. Yeah.
Of course they are. Yeah.
All right. Thank you so much for making time. Next time I'll ask you about the vertical, like humans going vertical that you briefly mentioned.
Oh yeah, I'll try to actually like do some reading on that. I don't know. Maybe we'll find somebody else who knows more about it. But it's just a thought. How to do it. All right. Thanks, Caden.
Thank you. Bye.
All right. Bye.
Thank you all for joining in. If you enjoyed this episode, share it with a friend. And I would super appreciate if you rated and reviewed the podcast on Apple or Spotify. To allow me to invest more time in research before I have a guest on, and maybe eventually get better recording tools one day, the easiest way to support the podcast and my ability to offer free dog training locally is to join my Patreon at patreon.com/adventuredogs. Talk to you soon.